Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever found yourself trapped in a conversation with your own mind, a conversation you never wanted to start, but can't seem to end? The kind where one anxious thought leads to another, and before long you feel like a prisoner inside your own head. We smile, we carry on, but deep down many of us are silently fighting battles no one else can see. The good news is we were never meant to fight those battles alone, and certainly not with our own strength. There is a power greater than our thoughts, and it does not come from within us. It comes from the one who formed the mind itself. The mind is not a still lake where ideas float gently like leaves on water. Rather, it is often a battleground alive with struggle, where light and darkness contend for influence. Negative thoughts do not simply appear out of nowhere like passive visitors. They arrive like invaders, armed and intentional. They march into our thinking with the precision of trained soldiers, using our weaknesses as their entry points. They know the back doors to our memories, the fragile scaffolding of our insecurities, and the scars we thought were long forgotten. Once inside, they do not sit politely. They build thrones, rearrange the furniture, and whisper over and over until their lies begin to feel like truth. These thoughts are rarely loud in the beginning. They arrive quietly, sometimes as questions, subtle, reasonable sounding. Why try again? What if you fail like last time? What if everyone finds out who you really are? Their power is not only in their content, but in their persistence. They do not knock once and leave. They linger. They repeat. They root themselves until our perspective becomes warped, and the sky overhead, though clear to others, looks stormy to us. It is not uncommon to carry a smile on our faces while our minds are a battlefield, echoing with voices of despair, regret, fear, or guilt. This conflict is not new. From ancient times, thinkers and saints alike have recognized that the mind is the first place the battle for the soul is fought. Actions begin with thoughts, and thoughts begin with subtle shifts in belief. A person rarely commits a great mistake without first entertaining a small thought, a whisper that perhaps right and wrong are negotiable. Likewise, discouragement doesn't arrive fully grown. It starts with a single seed, watered by silence, given space by neglect. What makes these thoughts so powerful is that they often contain fragments of truth. They wear the clothing of logic and realism. A failure in the past is remembered clearly, a mistake made is replayed with perfect detail. But what they lack is the fullness of perspective. They omit redemption. They ignore forgiveness. They are truth told with a crooked mouth, truth bent just enough to serve fear instead of hope. And once believed, they set a lens over the eyes through which everything else is seen. Relationships begin to look unsafe. Opportunities feel like traps. The future becomes a wall instead of a road. Many try to fight these thoughts through sheer willpower. They tell themselves to think positively, to be strong, to ignore the noise. But the battlefield of the mind is not won by slogans. It is not won by noise against noise. The darkness does not flee because we shout at it. It flees because a greater light arrives. God's role in this battlefield is not distant. He does not stand outside the mind, offering advice like a bystander. He enters the battlefield himself. The one who formed the mind knows its structure, its breaking points, and its healing paths. He understands what lies behind every thought, the unspoken fears, the forgotten traumas, the dreams buried under dust. He does not rebuke the soul for its turmoil. He offers truth deep enough to anchor it. The presence of God does not remove all struggle at once. Instead, it transforms the battlefield. His word becomes a sword, not to wound, but to cut through the lies. His spirit brings remembrance of things long forgotten, promises, identity, purpose. The whisper of despair is met with a louder, stiller voice. You are not alone. You are not condemned. You are being renewed. In this light, the nature of the battle changes. Negative thoughts still come, but they no longer rule. They enter, but they do not stay. They speak, but they are answered. And the mind, once a battleground, begins to resemble something else, a temple, a garden, a dwelling place of peace not born of circumstances, but of presence. This is no fantasy. It is a truth known by those who have walked through mental darkness and found the light not in themselves, but in a power greater, deeper, more tender than their own. A power that does not shout over the chaos, but speaks under it and stills it from within. When light enters a room, darkness does not argue. It does not linger or resist. It simply vanishes. This is the nature of light, not just to reveal, but to overcome. And this is how the truth of God functions in the human mind. It does not compete with negative thoughts on equal terms. It surpasses them. It replaces them not by force, but by clarity. Negative thoughts, those inner voices that whisper inadequacy, hopelessness, fear, feed on distortion. They thrive in places where truth is absent or dim. Their strength lies in confusion, where half-truths feel like whole ones, and lies where the mask of logic. The human mind is vulnerable to these thoughts because it is shaped by experience. A harsh word from the past can echo for years. A failure remembered too vividly can become a prophecy rather than a lesson. These mental patterns, formed over time, do not break easily. They become the lenses through which we interpret reality, filtering everything through a sense of lack, shame, or defeat. It is not merely that we think wrongly, it is that we have come to accept these thoughts as part of our identity. The lie doesn't feel like a lie anymore, it feels like who we are. And yet truth, real truth, has an authority that no thought, no emotion, no memory can withstand. God's truth is not just a collection of good ideas or comforting phrases. It is reality itself, spoken from the mouth of the one who defines reality. His truth is not affected by circumstances, not shaped by culture, and not dependent on our moods. When it is received into the heart, it begins to dismantle the structures built by years of distortion. Where there was once the belief, I am alone, God's truth declares, I will never leave you. Where there was shame, you are too broken to be loved, God speaks, you are my beloved, in you I am well pleased. These are not abstract theological statements. They are anchors, solid and unchanging, meant to hold the mind steady when the waves of doubt and fear rise. But the power of truth is not automatic. It must be received, remembered, and believed. And often it must be repeated, not because it changes, but because we do. Our thoughts, like rivers, carve out familiar paths. God's truth arrives not only to interrupt those paths, but to redirect the flow. This process is not passive. It requires intention, not striving, but openness. When we begin to fill our minds with Scripture, meditate on divine promises, and reflect on the character of God, we are not engaging in empty religious habit. We are, in fact, replacing the soundtrack of our lives. We are giving space for a new voice to speak, one that does not accuse or belittle, but calls, restores, and clarifies. The lies that once seemed so convincing begin to lose their grip, not because we shouted them down, but because a greater word has been spoken over them. God's truth is not always loud. It may come in whispers, in quiet reminders, in a verse recalled at the right moment, in the stillness of prayer, but its impact is unmistakable. It may not change the circumstances around us immediately, but it transforms how we see them. It lifts our gaze from the pit to the promise, from the wound to the healing, from the failure to the future. The truth does not merely help us feel better, it shows us what is better, what is more real than fear, more enduring than failure, and more powerful than any lie. And so, when the mind is flooded with negativity, the solution is not to wrestle endlessly with each thought. The better way is to introduce truth, light, and let it do what it always does: expose, replace, and renew. We do not need to create this truth, it already exists. We do not need to force it to work. It already holds power. What is required of us is simply to open the window, to let the light in, and to allow the Word of God to be what it always has been, the final word. There is a kind of weariness that goes deeper than the body. It is the exhaustion of the mind that has tried for too long to carry what it was never meant to bear. People often try to will their way out of anxiety, depression, fear, and guilt, treating these burdens like weights to be lifted through sheer mental effort. They say to themselves, "Be strong, don't think about it, move on," and for a time perhaps they manage to suppress the rising tide. But soon enough the tide returns. The same thoughts resurface, sometimes stronger, sometimes disguised but never fully gone. It becomes a cycle, effort followed by collapse, determination followed by despair. The will, however noble, is not enough to conquer the storms of the mind. This truth often remains hidden in a world that glorifies self-control and self-mastery. Society celebrates the disciplined, the mentally strong, the unshakable. But beneath that admiration is a quiet lie that we must fix ourselves by ourselves. We are told that peace is something we must earn, that calm is the result of thinking correctly and trying hard enough. And so, when the struggle persists, we feel not only the weight of our thoughts but the shame of failure, as though the presence of negative thoughts is proof of spiritual weakness or personal defect. But God does not approach us with the same expectation. He does not command the tired soul to fight harder. He invites it to surrender. Not surrender in the sense of giving up, but in the truest and most profound sense, surrender as trust. The idea that God meets us not at the height of our strength, but at the end of our ability, runs contrary to our instincts. We want to be whole before we come to Him. We want to understand everything before we believe. We want to present a clean heart, not a broken one. And yet it is the broken heart He desires, the weary mind He welcomes. There is something sacred in surrender. It is not passivity. It is an active choice to let go of the illusion of control. It is acknowledging that we do not have the answers, that we cannot fix the mind from within the same mind that is suffering. Surrender is saying, "I cannot carry this anymore," and handing it over to the one who can. It is not weakness, but wisdom, the wisdom to recognize our limits and God's limitlessness. The act of surrender opens the door for grace, and grace, unlike willpower, does not demand, it gives. When we surrender our thoughts to God, we are not abandoning responsibility. We are inviting transformation. We are allowing a greater hand to reshape what we cannot. And in that act, something begins to change. We stop striving to silence the noise and begin to listen for a different voice, one that speaks peace, not panic, hope, not despair. That voice does not always come in dramatic revelations. Often it arrives in stillness, in the quiet realization that we are not alone, that we are seen, known, and loved even in the midst of confusion. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, is not a poetic phrase. It is a real and living presence that can enter the human mind and begin to reorder its chaos. This peace does not require us to have everything figured out. It does not depend on perfect behavior or complete understanding. It comes as a gift, unearned, unexpected, yet wholly sufficient. When we stop trying to fix our thoughts and instead invite God into them, we begin to experience that peace. It settles where fear once ruled. It breathes where anxiety once suffocated. It holds steady when everything else shifts. And though the world may still spin and troubles may still press in, the inner life begins to stabilize. We find ourselves able to think more clearly, not because we have conquered the storm, but because we have trusted the one who can walk on water. The mind left to itself becomes a maze, but in surrender, it becomes a place of meeting where God does not just visit, but dwells, and where His presence brings with it the renewal we could never achieve on our own. Prayer is often misunderstood. Many imagine it as a ritual, a duty reserved for the devout, something to be done at specific times with proper words and reverent posture. Others reduce it to a last resort, something only turned to when all else fails, a lifeline tossed toward the sky in desperation. But in truth, prayer is far more than a habit or a reaction. It is not confined to stained glass moments or whispered requests in the dark. Prayer is a lifeline, yes, but not because it is a tool of the desperate. It is a connection to the very source of life. When the mind is weighed down by negative thoughts, when despair, fear, shame, and anxiety seem to echo louder than any voice of hope, prayer becomes more than a practice. It becomes breath. The human mind, for all its brilliance, is fragile. It is a place where memories live, where hopes are born, where fears linger. It is the seat of reflection and imagination, but also of rumination and dread. In seasons of struggle, the mind becomes like a stormed castle wall still standing, but the halls inside rattling with confusion. Thoughts that were once manageable now swirl endlessly. A simple doubt turns into an obsession. A single mistake replays in loops. In such moments, advice feels hollow. Logic cannot always reason with sorrow. Motivation fades. And yet, even there, a simple whispered prayer, "God, help me," can begin to change the atmosphere. Not because it is eloquent, but because it opens a door. Prayer is not magic. It does not instantly erase pain or banish all troubling thoughts. But it shifts the posture of the soul. It moves us from isolation into communion. When we pray, even clumsily, we are acknowledging that we are not alone in the dark. We are not the only ones aware of our suffering. We are inviting the presence of the One who knows our minds better than we do, the One who does not flinch at confusion, who is not impatient with our repeated questions. This is where prayer becomes a kind of inner citadel, not a hiding place from the world, but a stronghold in the midst of it. In prayer, the mind is not ignored or silenced, it is heard. God listens, not to performance, but to honesty. And honesty in prayer is more powerful than perfection. It is in saying, "I don't understand," or "I'm afraid," or even "I'm angry," that we find the beginning of healing. These are not signs of weak faith. They are signs of real relationship. One does not hide their worst thoughts from someone they trust completely. And in trusting God enough to speak even the darkest parts of ourselves, we allow Him into the very places where the battle is fiercest. It is also in prayer that we remember truth. When negative thoughts distort our view, prayer grounds us in what does not change. Even if we do not feel it, the act of praying realigns our attention. It is as if we are adjusting a telescope, taking it away from the swirling chaos and aiming it at something fixed, something eternal. We may begin a prayer full of fear, but often find by the end that the fear has lost some of its sharpness, not because the problem is solved, but because we've glimpsed something greater. The heart quiets not through effort, but through focus. Prayer does not only lift requests, it brings God close. He is already near, but prayer opens the awareness of that nearness. It is not God who is absent, but often we who have become unaware. The very act of turning toward Him, even with broken words, stirs that awareness. And with awareness comes peace, not a peace built on understanding everything, but one that surpasses understanding entirely. It is the kind of peace that holds the mind when it wants to race, that steadies the heart when it wants to collapse. It does not come from knowing what will happen next, but from knowing who holds all things together. In a world where the mind is constantly bombarded by noise, distraction, and pressure, prayer becomes not just a practice of escape, but of return, a return to the presence of God, where the soul can breathe, the thoughts can settle, and the truth can speak louder than the lie. This is where the healing of the mind begins, not with striving, but with turning, not with answers, but with connection, not with our strength, but with His presence. There is a quiet mystery in how God works, not always with thunder, not always with spectacle, but often through the slow, deliberate rhythm of transformation. The human mind is not like a switch to be flipped from darkness to light. It is more like a garden long untended, where weeds have grown deep and wild. Negative thoughts, like those weeds, do not appear overnight. They are often the result of seasons of neglect, old wounds, false beliefs, and patterns passed down or picked up along the way. When we invite God into this space, He does not simply remove the overgrowth with one sweeping gesture. He begins the work of renewal with tenderness, patience, and precision. The transformation of the mind is not sudden but steady, not violent but redemptive. At first, we may not notice anything has changed. We may still wake with anxious thoughts, still battle discouragement, still feel the weight of thoughts that accuse or confuse. But transformation often begins beneath the surface. God does not only treat the symptoms of broken thinking, He rewires the source. He touches not only what we say to ourselves, but what we believe about ourselves. He uproots the deeply rooted lies that we are unworthy, unloved, incapable, forgotten. And in place of those lies, He plants something far stronger: truth, but not cold, distant truth. Living truth. Personal, steady, eternal. This work is sometimes invisible. A person may spend time in prayer, read scripture, or sit quietly with God and feel no grand revelation. But slowly their responses begin to change. What once triggered panic now produces a pause. What once led to despair now invites a moment of reflection. They begin to speak to themselves differently, not because they've trained their minds through effort, but because a different voice has begun to echo louder than the old ones. That voice does not accuse. It does not mock or rush. It reminds. It affirms. It lifts. The Spirit of God is not limited to spiritual spaces. He does not only meet us during moments of worship or in the walls of a church. He meets us in the ordinary flow of life, in traffic, in solitude, in the quiet in-between. This is part of how transformation occurs. God enters the normal and brings with Him something holy. His presence becomes part of our thinking patterns, not through dramatic encounters alone, but through the daily faithful invitation of "Come and be with me here too." Over time, the mind begins to change, not just in crisis, but in routine. The reactive becomes reflective. The fearful becomes trusting. The restless becomes still. Sometimes the transformation includes discomfort. God surfaces things we've buried. He puts a mirror to the parts of ourselves we've hidden. But this is not to shame, it is to heal. He does not show us our brokenness so that we will despair, but so that we will understand what He is repairing. This is where His gentleness matters most. He does not tear down the old to leave a ruin. He clears space for new growth. And because His work is complete, He does not rush the process. What matters to Him is not how fast the mind changes, but how deeply. The renewal of the mind is a shared process. It is not something we undergo while doing nothing, nor something we achieve through willpower alone. It is a partnership, a dance of surrender and response. We open the door and God steps in. We quiet ourselves and He speaks. We bring our honest, chaotic thoughts, and He brings order not through condemnation, but through revelation. He shows us who He is, and in seeing Him clearly we begin to see ourselves rightly. Even the smallest steps matter. A single verse remembered at the right moment. A single decision not to follow a familiar mental spiral. A single breath offered to God when the pressure rises. These moments accumulate. They are not wasted. Like rain on dry soil, they soften what was once hardened, and in time they allow the seeds of truth to grow. What begins as barely noticeable becomes something rooted. The garden, once overgrown with thoughts that suffocated, begins to bloom with peace, clarity, and hope. Not all at once, but faithfully, until the mind is not just a place of struggle, but a place of renewal. The mind was never meant to be a battlefield without reinforcement. Though it may often feel like we are alone with our thoughts, especially the dark, relentless ones, God never intended for us to carry the burden of mental struggle in isolation. From the very beginning, the human story has been one of relationship. God walked with Adam in the garden. He spoke to prophets, comforted kings, restored the brokenhearted, and called His people to walk not only with Him but with one another. His presence is not distant or abstract. It is deeply personal and unceasing. In the face of negative thoughts, this truth becomes vital. Because what we battle internally is not always rooted in what is happening around us, but what we believe is true about ourselves, others, and God. God's presence is more than a comforting thought. It is an active reality. He is not a distant observer, watching us struggle from afar. He is near not only in the high moments of joy, but also in the quiet rooms of doubt and despair. He does not recoil from confusion or hesitate at our weakness. He remains, When the mind grows heavy with accusation, you're not enough, you'll never change, you're alone, God does not shout over the noise with force. Instead, he draws near like a hand gently placed on a trembling shoulder. He reminds us that he sees it all and still chooses to stay. This nearness is not only emotional, it is spiritual and mental. God is not afraid to enter our thought life. He is not limited to worship songs and sermons. He is present in the wandering thoughts of early morning, the spiraling worries of the afternoon, the quiet tears shed behind closed doors. He does not need perfect words or rehearsed prayers to engage with us. His presence is constant, steady, and entirely willing to meet us where we are, even if where we are feels far from peaceful. When we understand that we are not thinking alone, something begins to shift. The thoughts that once held absolute power lose their grip when exposed to divine presence. The lie that once seemed irrefutable, God has forgotten me, cannot survive in the light of the one who says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Not as a poetic comfort, but as a covenant promise. When we bring our thoughts into the presence of God, they are no longer allowed to grow wild and unchallenged. They are seen, named, and held up against a greater truth. This is why God invites us into ongoing communion, not only to worship or to ask, but to dwell, to abide. The soul finds rest not merely because the circumstances improve, but because it becomes aware of who is near. Negative thoughts feed on isolation. They thrive when we believe we must face them alone, when we believe we are the only ones thinking such things. But when the presence of God as a God is acknowledged, loneliness is shattered. The echo chamber of self-condemnation is broken. We begin to see that we are not abandoned, and that even in the worst of our thoughts, God is not absent, he is attentive. His presence also brings a stabilizing power. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is as simple as a sense of calm that wasn't there before, a brief clarity in the middle of mental fog, or the sudden recollection of a promise we had long forgotten. God does not always remove the storm, but he still speaks peace into it. When we remember that he is with us, we are reminded that we are not slaves to our thoughts. We are not the sum of our worst moments. We are not defined by our inner battles. We are defined by his love, his nearness, and his commitment to restore us fully. And so, in the journey toward healing from negative thoughts, the presence of God is not a side comfort, it is the center. It is the constant we return to when our thoughts run wild. It is the grounding point when fear begins to spin 1,000 imagined futures. It is the gentle whisper in the soul that says, you are not alone in this. I am here. I am with you. And I will carry you through. This companionship, divine and unwavering, becomes the atmosphere where transformation happens not through striving, but through abiding. When all is said and done, the power of God to remove negative thoughts is not found in a sudden escape from struggle, but in a steady, holy renewal of the mind. He does not call us to pretend we are strong, nor expect us to win battles with sheer will. Instead, he meets us where we are with our doubts, our fears, our chaos, and gently begins the work of restoration. Through surrender, through prayer, through his abiding presence and transforming grace, he leads us out of the shadows not with force, but with truth. And as we learn to lean on him not just in moments of crisis, but in the quiet corners of daily life, we find that the thoughts which once ruled us begin to fade. In their place grows a peace the world cannot give, and a strength not our own. This is the power of God, not only to calm the storm, but to calm the soul within it.